right. Hello and welcome officially to episode 12, season 2 of Technically Speaking. This is Brandon Burton, your host here at Technically Speaking, and very excited to bring you today's session. We're going to recap a number of conversations that have come from both season 1 and season 2, and some of what I call probably the most important content that we've brought to you over the course of those couple of seasons, and really ground things on what I feel are really the core principles of especially water damage mitigation as we go through this. So really getting into my roots and kind of my background in the water damage mitigation space. So as we get started, of course, I got to run through a couple quick housekeeping items. So just a reminder for those that are new to Technically Speaking, we do not use the chat feature in Zoom. We use the Q&A tool. So at any point, if you've got a question that you would like me to address at the end of today's session, make sure you drop that into the Q&A tool. And no questions are out of bounds as long as they're industry related in some way. I will do my very best to give you the information that I have. And if I don't know the answer, I will go track it down for you and I'll get you the answer. So remember to use that Q&A tool, and again, at any point during the presentation today. Those that are attending live with me get to go through that Q&A process at the end, a little bit of a town hall session at the end of today's presentation, and that's what you get for being here live. When we post these as a recording, if you weren't aware, we actually cut the Q&A portion off, so that's kind of a benefit of attending live with us. So with that, let's go ahead and get started here with the end of our second full season of Technically Speaking. So to start things off here today, what I want to do is kick things off with a discussion of the restoration process, the overall process that we use to ensure that we are deploying the most effective, the most efficient, and the most accurate process to any water damage mitigation project. Now, for some of you, this flow chart may look familiar. This is something that I have used in a lot of the training that I've done in restoration over the last 25, 30 years to really give a structure to what we do in water damage mitigation and to help us move through the decision-making process on any water damage mitigation project. And it embodies the most critical pieces of information and the most critical thinking that we need to apply as professionals in the water mitigation space. And it really hinges on these 4 arrows that you see over here on the left-hand side. There's something that we call the nose of drying. Now, the things that we need to know and understand about the presence of moisture and the behavior of moisture in that space. And it drives the entire decision-making process around what is best for that specific project. And they're very simple in the questions themselves. This questions sound very, very simple, but when you analyze the question and truly understand how to answer it, it really is like peeling back the layers of an onion, and it really gets into the heart of what we're set out to accomplish. The very first question that we need to understand about the mitigation process is just understanding and identifying what is wet. Right? Very, very basic question. Seems like a very simple question from the surface, but when we analyze this, there's a lot more to understanding what is wet than typically is obvious to the uneducated or untrained professional in the mitigation space. And what I mean by that is defining what is wet is something that needs to be done at the component level. And I think a lot of us in this industry don't necessarily understand how critical this is to mitigation. In other words, I very, very commonly hear when an inspection is performed or somebody is discussing documentation or even reporting in documentation that they've done an inspection, I'll hear phrases that embody an assembly when they describe what is wet. I very rarely hear people use terms that describe a component. And it's very critical that as a professional restorer, we make a distinction between these two and we speak in terms of components. So what does that mean? What is an assembly? What is a component? Why is that so important? So an assembly is a wall, a floor, a ceiling, a cabinet, a couch. Those are assemblies. A component is a sheet of OSB subflooring. Right, that's a component. A 2x4 plate, right, that's a component. Now, those components are parts of an assembly, and if we don't drive down to the component level and understanding what is truly wet, we're going to misapply a number of things that are going to come out in this process and in this flow chart. We cannot drive the restoration process accurately if we don't drive down to the component level. So once we get to the component level and we truly define what is wet by tracking water from its source or sources, depending upon the complexity of a particular project, and then defining the migration from that source. And migration being something that needs to be thought about in a three-dimensional plane, right? The extent of migration has not been established until you start from a source and track the movement of water, aka migration of water, through a particular direction and find materials that are truly unaffected. And that's left, right, forward, backward, up, and down, right? In all of those directions, we need to find the extent of that migration. We haven't found that extent until, again, we have found materials that are unaffected. That's how we understand that we found that edge. And this, again, is an uber critical part to the process. It's a simple question, what is wet? But unless we have the component, we know the sources, and we've tracked migration from those sources in all of those directions, then one of the most potentially dangerous elements of a mitigation project could come back to haunt us, and that's undiscovered water in a property that does not get properly addressed, that is found months after the mitigation process concludes and causes the additional damages that we're there to mitigate, right? The whole purpose of water damage restoration is to prevent the damage that water can cause. Once we identify what is wet, the next step in the restoration process is to determine restorability, right? Is this item that I have found that is wet, is it something that should be restored, or is it something that should be replaced? And we can debate this in a lot of different ways, but however you debate it, it's going to boil down to three key properties. There are three things about an item that has become affected that will determine whether or not that item is restorable or not restorable. And they really need to be assessed in this order. The first order is contamination. Is there an issue with contamination related to this material that is affected? Category of water, pre-existing exposure to a contaminant that has contaminated that item, that may be amplified or made worse by the contact with water, that could be amplified or made worse with the drying system. Is contamination an issue? If it is, that becomes the priority at that point. And even the S500 stands it up this way, that when contaminants are present, they take precedent over the mitigation process. It doesn't mean we don't stabilize, it's a whole different conversation, but we aren't going to start an aggressive drying process until we know that the contamination has been properly addressed. If contamination is not an issue, then we move to the second issue, which is damage. Has the contact with water caused a permanent change in the appearance, the function, the integrity of that component? Right? Has it caused a permanent change? Will drying reverse that effect? If drying reverses the effect, it's not permanent. In other words, we reserve the term damage for something very, very specific. It is a permanent artifact of the contact with moisture that has altered its ability to perform its function as a part of that assembly. And depending on what it is, appearance may be important, it may not be, right? But its ability to have the integrity that it needs and the performance that it needs as a component is likely going to be true no matter where it is in the assembly. So has water caused a permanent change to that building material? If it has, then again, the answer becomes a lot simpler, right, in terms of restorability. If no damage has occurred, then the final area of determination is cost. What is going to be more cost effective? Replacing this particular component that has become wet, or deploying the drying resources necessary to remove the moisture from it, which is going to be more cost effective. Now, relatively simple in consideration, but I want to unpack these just a little bit further before we move down the process here. So with contamination, the primary thing that we're worried about is category. Right, what's the category? Category 1, Category 2, Category 3, these all come from our S500. There is a materials section within the S500 that articulates for most of the common assemblies and materials that we encounter, if they're restorable or not restorable based on their category. The secondary consideration to this is then pre-existing contamination issues, right? Or the presence rather of hazardous materials and regulated materials. Once we've gone through that consideration, again, it's damage. And the key word that I want to drive here for damage is there something that is permanent, right? Has there been a change permanently to the appearance, to the performance, or the integrity of that building material? The one that's more difficult is cost. Right, most of us as restorers would have a hard time looking at a wall assembly and saying that that wall assembly will cost exactly $372.17 for me to remove baseboard, reset baseboard, and then paint to match and repair, right? Most of us may not necessarily have that kind of an estimating background or reconstruction experience to know that. But even if you did, I've been in the drying industry for 30 plus years. It's really difficult for me to look at a wall and say that's going to cost me $215 to dry. That's super, super difficult. And the reason it is because we really don't know the history of that wall. If that wall has been wet before, it's going to take longer to dry this time because the nature of the drywall has changed a bit, right? If that wall's been painted 5 times, it's going to be harder to dry than if it was painted once. Right? And I can't see that. I don't see the layers of paint. So there are a number of variables that I just can't account for, not the least of which being I don't know how this occupant is going to affect my drying equipment when I leave compared to the last project, right? So when we identify the area of cost, I want to give you a key driver here, and it's the word obvious. Is there anything obvious about the material that would make it difficult or slow to dry? Anything obvious? Is there a vapor barrier in that assembly? Are there excessive built-up layers in that assembly? Are there hidden, trapped pockets of liquid water, standing water inside the assembly, right? These are things that would make it very obvious that it is going to be cost prohibitive to dry it without some physical manipulation, either disassembly or gaining access to creating holes. Those are things that are obvious. If there's nothing obvious and contamination wasn't an issue and damage wasn't an issue, then the result of this discussion is going to be restore, right? We are going to initiate by restoring the affected item. If any of these were an issue, then we're going to lean towards replace. Okay. Now, here's the reason why this is so important. The reason why this is important is because every job is unique, right? Every restoration project is different. And because every project is different, the one thing we have to avoid doing as restoration professionals is walking into a project and doing what we did on the last project simply because it worked on the last project. That's one of the worst mentalities that we can adopt as a building triage expert, right? We're supposed to be that medical triage expert, if you will, in an ER. But in the case of this structure and this particular project, given the trauma that this particular building has encountered. And the only way that we can do that is by being responsive to the information that this project is giving me. And that's what this process is built to do. It's built to ensure that your mitigation process is unique to that project and the information available on that project. Now, that's important for lots of reasons, right? Because it's going to drive me to make decisions where I'm going to deploy what is most cost-effective and efficient for this project. It's also going to drive me to have the details and the data I need to justify all of the decisions that I make, right? Why did you remove the baseboard on that project? If your answer is that's because we always do, it's the wrong answer, right? If your answer is because of this information on this project, that's what was unique about this project, then we've got a good solid answer, right? We've got a reason why we're deploying the service that we are on this particular project. Now let's move down the process here a little bit. So let's say we've determined that the building material is restorable. What happens next? So if the building material is restorable, then we move back over here to our nose of drying and we ask the next question. How wet? Now, this is asked on that first monitoring visit. It is not good enough to know that a material is wet. I have to know how wet it is if I'm going to restore it. Now, if we decided we were going to replace it or remove it or disassemble it, then we don't necessarily need to quantify the amount of moisture in it. We just need to know that it was affected, that it was wet. But if you're going to restore it, you must know how much moisture is in that building material. That means I need to have a set meter on a set setting in a set location of that building material, or I have a displayed value. That displayed value is a quantification that gives me the exact number I'm starting from on that particular project. Only once I have that and I know how much moisture is actually in that material and in each material that comprises that assembly, can we then move to the next stage, which is to deploy a drying plan. Now, your drying plan is classifying, right? Giving a class of water to the restoration project, which relates to how much evaporation we're going to expect from this entire drying chamber as we begin the drying process. It's also what's going to drive the type and placement of my equipment. What is my strategy for air movement? What is my strategy for humidity control? Am I going to use mechanical dehumidification? Am I going to use outdoor air? All of this is fed by not only my psychrometrics, which we'll talk about later in today's session, but how wet these building materials actually are and where these materials are in the assembly, these first two questions that we've asked, right? Now, that would wrap up and conclude that initial process, that first emergency visit to the project, everything that we've outlaid on this flow chart. After that process is done, we come back 24 hours later and we ask ourselves the next question in the process. And to me, this is where the expertise of restoration really starts to shine. Is it drying? Right? There's only one way for me to know that a building material is drying, and that is to use the same meter on the same setting in the same location of the same building material, that same component, and then document that data into the same place that yesterday's data was documented so I can compare the two. Now, notice how many times as I asked this question about drying that I used the word same. Monitoring is a process of consistency. If I change anything about the method of collecting that data, I do not know if I'm drying. I can't stress this hard enough. As a restoration professional, as a mitigation professional, the one thing that I uniquely need to be able to do better than anybody else can do it is not only cause a building material to dry, but be able to document that I'm achieving that result, right? That's my skill set. My core skill set, from at least a technical perspective, is the ability to cause and document drying in that building at a rate greater than nature would have done by itself, right? I need to be able to prove it. I need to be able to take credit for it. I need to be able to use it as justification for everything else that we're doing. For example, if somebody even asks me, why did you do it this way? And I can easily say, because it worked, right? If I have the justification to stand that up. If I don't have the justification to stand that up, it doesn't matter what I did. I can't prove that it worked, right? So same meter, same setting, same location of the same material documented into the same tool so that I can compare the two and denote whether or not we're making progress. Now, I could have a couple of different answers to this question, right? I could determine that we are not drying. That's a possible answer. So let's come all the way over here and let's say that no, we're not. The first thing I want to share with you is that's okay. Right? You've probably heard of the 80-20 rule, right? It applies to lots of things in life. It applies to this as well. As a mitigation expert, you're not going to be right 100% of the time for the same reasons that I denoted that cost was difficult to assess up above. You don't know the full history of that building material. You don't know what those occupants are going to do with your drying system when you're not there, right? You don't know the full makeup of the layers of paint on that wall assembly. And for those reasons, you're never going to be 100% confident that things are making progress. So it's okay if I come back 24 hours later and discover that my assumption was inaccurate. That's okay, as long as I discover it 24 hours later, right? As long as I discover it immediately. right? We apply the treatment, we monitor the patient. If the patient responds to the treatment, great, keep applying the treatment. If the patient does not respond, don't be insane, right? Hopefully you've heard the definition of the word insanity, but the word insanity means doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result every time. That's insanity, right? So if it isn't working, don't keep doing it. Change what you're doing, and that's okay. So come back to the top of the process here and reevaluate if it isn't working. Now that it's been wet for another 24 hours, is contamination now an issue? It might be, right? Is damage now an issue? It might be. And if they aren't, then what's more cost effective? At that point, getting more aggressive with your drying system, right? Stronger deployment of your drying resources, or just removing the material that's not progressing, right? And what's most obvious, all right? The reason this is so valuable in the process is that now, if I make that change 24 hours later, not only am I addressing these issues now that I know where they are, I have justification for the reason I made the change, right? If I now make the change of removing that baseboard or making a hole in that wall or getting rid of a layer on an assembly, I have documentation that stands up the reason why that was necessary on this job, as opposed rather to the reason it wasn't necessary on the last. The last job, we made progress. We didn't need to pull it. This job, it didn't make progress, and we need to, right? Because it's not making progress. So again, the purpose of this process is to ensure that every decision that we make as a restoration professional is grounded in sound reasoning, right? It has justification and something to stand it up. Now, if it is making progress, great, wonderful, okay? It's making progress. So now we ask ourselves the next question. And the next question is simply, is it done? Make that a little bit thinner pen there. And this means that I need to have things like dry standards, right? I need to understand what done looks like. Done does not mean the absence of moisture. Done means that I've reduced the amount of moisture in the material to a level at which it no longer has the ability to cause damage, right? It is going to be a moisture level that is going to allow that material to perform its normal function. It's not going to drive any damages. And one of the key ways that we stand that up is through the acquisition of dry standards. A dry standard just being a reading on a known unaffected material in a known unaffected location. If we have some time, I can talk a whole lot about how we can accurately obtain dry standards, because that's in and of itself a bit of an art, but that's the basis of it. Now, if it is done, great. Then we can start making some reductions on our building or our drying equipment, start reducing the control that we're having over the temperatures and humidities in the space as those materials begin to dry. If it isn't done, again, that's okay. And this is one of my favorite places on the not psychrometric chart, but on this particular process. And I want you to kind of follow my blue line here. Is it done? No. Well, that's okay. If it's not done, we already determined it was making progress. Yes, it was making progress. Give it 24 more hours because your system is working. This is the most profitable place in this entire process, is this loop that is occurring right here. Your process has been deployed. Your process is effective. It needs more time. So allow the equipment to run for another day, right? This is what generates the profitability within the restoration space. The more you deploy the thinking process that we outlined in this part of the chart, the more your jobs are going to live in that part of the chart, right? This area down here in blue, this is your 50% profit margin, 60% profit margin, this little guy right down here. This area up in here is 10% at best. You can have a job cost 40% less and make you 20% more by pushing it into the blue area of this chart. Then everybody wins. That's the other reason why this process is so critical, right? It not only drives the most efficient process and the right process for any given project, it also drives the process that tends to be the most profitable. Okay, so that as a whole, I wanted to start with this because this is so foundational to what we do in the water damage mitigation space. And as an organization, as a restoration professional, if there were one thing that you really wanted to set kind of as your New Year's resolution moving into 2024 that I could impart on you to really drive your success in the industry, it's really honing your mentality, around this decision-making tree and ensuring that you're making the right decisions on each project that are unique to those particular projects. And that's what this is really set to stand up and to analyze. So with that, we'll close out on that first topic. It's a good reminder for me to remind everybody, because I don't see any questions in the Q&A yet. As I go through the presentation today, at any point, if you've got a question, open up that Q&A tool, drop a question into that Q&A, and as we hit the end of today's presentation, like I said, I'll open the floor and we will address any and all of those questions. So let's go ahead and move forward. The next thing I want to hit here in our season recap is talk a little bit about some of the core things in and around psychrometrics that we've touched on in the last couple of years that are really foundational to the restoration profession. And first and foremost, I think the most obvious thing that I can touch on here is just that psychrometry isn't a box that needs to be checked, right? That's probably the most important thing that I can touch on. In my career in the industry, especially over the last 5 years, I've had a lot of exposure into the other side of the restoration space and seeing a lot of what's flowing through documentation and what's kind of living its way through the claims process, if you will, with insurance companies. And it constantly amazes me how much psychrometry really ends up just being a box that gets checked, right? We're recording certain readings because those readings need to be recorded, but they're not really getting digested. They're not getting used. And it can be super obvious in some of that documentation. And what that does is it's really inspired me, especially going into next year's sessions with Technically Speaking. It's really inspired me to spend a lot more time just articulating where in psychrometry you're going to get the most value, how to deploy that efficiently in the field with your technicians, and also how to drive the education process efficiently in your business to ensure techs are getting out in the field with the right basic core knowledge behind psychrometrics. The key to that and the foundation to that is something that I'm a huge advocate for, and that is that although we have all of these wonderful applications, not the least of which being CoreLogic applications that give you a place to record this information and automatically calculate your grains and make sure that your documentation is filled out, and that's wonderful. But unless you pull out a psychrometric chart every once in a while and actually plot some readings on a psychrometric chart, you're not going to understand psychrometry. You've got to understand the chart to get it, right? In fact, you should be at a point where you could draw a psychrometric chart, at least the core of a psychrometric chart, without even looking at one, right? And be able to draw a relatively accurate relationship between temperature and relative humidity at a minimum, okay? So with that said, one of the things I really want to drive home here is just making sure that we understand just the basic composition of a psychrometric chart. And then secondarily, the most elementary reason why this is important to me as a drying contractor. And so to start with the first of those 2 points, understanding the psychrometric chart and what stands up the chart starts with just looking at this temperature scale down here at the bottom, where in this particular case, we're in Fahrenheit. It's a dry bulb, and there's a reason why we call it that, but I won't get into that today. But with temperature, notice over here on the left-hand side, where my temperature is 20, notice how tall the chart is. Then over here, when I get into my high temperatures, notice what the chart does. In fact, it would just keep going and right off the screen there, but we ran out of room, right? The warmer the temperature is, the larger the chart becomes. And there are reasons for this, very, very specific reasons in physics for this. Temperature is what you and I feel as it relates to the amount of energy that is in something, right? How much energy that something has that you and I can feel. It's called sensible heat. If you and I can feel a higher temperature, so can everything else, including water molecules. They can feel that higher temperature. The greater that temperature, the greater that energy, the more rapidly and the more violently all of those molecules are moving and shaking, and therefore the more likely they are to become a vapor. Right? High energy supports higher vapor content in the air because there's more energy to support it. Lower temperatures are less energy, right? There's less going on to support that water being in a vapor state, because it takes energy for water to be a vapor, right? And if there's not enough energy, it's just going to condense and turn back into a liquid. And that's the reason why this relationship looks like it does. Lower temperatures, low energy. Higher temperatures, high energy. And the greater the energy, the greater the abilities to support water as a vapor. Now, this is important to the drying process because my goal is to take a building material that is wet, aka water is absorbed or is a liquid, and drive that moisture to leave that material as a vapor, right? Which obviously, based on what we just discussed, temperature is kind of important for that, right? Energy is pretty important for that. So a psychrometric chart, first and foremost, helps me understand that importance, right? The secondary thing that the chart helps me understand is that there's only a certain capacity. No matter how big this container is, there's only a certain capacity in that container for moisture. And we need to be weary of containers that end up very, very full of moisture, right? We need that additional capacity to support my drying effort. And there are relative humidities help me understand that. They help me analyze that, and they help me understand the risk of moisture causing damage as opposed to a drying air mass that's going to support the drying process. Now, we did a couple of great episodes on psychrometry and the importance of psychrometry earlier in the year. I'm not going to drive real deep into that. What I want to do for now, though, let's move forward. And I want to talk about one thing with psychrometrics that is uber critical that often gets overlooked. Next, I'm going to come back to that slide and start with this one. Here's the mistake that we make with psychrometrics most commonly in our industry. The most common mistake that we make is we walk in as a technician, so I'll draw my technician here, and my technician has an instrument in their hand, and they take a temperature and a humidity reading with that instrument while they're standing in the middle of the room. The air that we just measured is the air right here. That's the air we just measured. That's what we document. That's what we record into our readings on our documentation. And because that's what we've recorded into our documentation, that's all that gets considered. Well, unfortunately, the air that was just documented is irrelevant. The air that is in the middle of that room is doing nothing for the drying process. So no matter how much I understand about psychrometry or how much time I've spent digesting and understanding that psychrometrics, if that's the only reading that I take, I'm not doing psychrometrics justice. Because the psychrometry that really matters is the psychrometry right down here. If what I'm trying to dry is that floor. Or it's the psychrometry in here. If what I'm trying to dry are the surfaces inside that wall assembly. That's where the psychrometry matters, right? It's the air that is in contact with the wet surface that's doing the work. It's not the air in the middle of the room. So for that reason, one of the most basic things in psychrometrics that we need to understand is that one reading inside of your affected area or your affected drying chamber isn't really fitting the bill. Now, this is an important reading. This reading in the affected area is an important reading. And the reason it's important is because I'm going to use that as a point of comparison. And I'm going to compare that to these other locations where water exists. Wherever that water is, I'm going to make that comparison. And if that reading looks wonderful, but the reading down at location 1 on my floor does not, then I'm missing a really important element in the drying process. And now I'll back up to the previous slide. Circulation and air movement. One of the most important pieces of the drying puzzle is ensuring that your drying chamber has an even distribution of opportunity to dry, right? I need to ensure that the temperature and humidity that drives the drying process is in all of the locations where I need it to be. And if I do that, then I get the counter to that. I'm also evacuating the moisture that has evaporated and putting that back up into my chamber so it can be evacuated through ventilation or dealt with through dehumidification, right? And air movement is such a critical piece to that. As an industry, I personally, I would love to see, a lot more assessment with our hygrometers to determine whether or not we really do have airflow across all of the surfaces where drying needs to happen. Because I can validate that air movers have been installed properly by taking a few more atmospheric readings down near or at the wet surface and just verifying that that air looks the same as the air that's up 3 feet up in the middle of my room, right? If that air matches, then I've done a good job in that room with the installation of my drying equipment. And if you really want to be accurate, I won't stop there. I'll draw a really simple floor plan. And with yellow here, I'm going to indicate some of the places where you might want to take a temperature and humidity reading, right? First of all, a temperature and humidity at this location would be really valuable if I compared it to a temperature and humidity at this location. If this is a drying chamber, right, and I have a dehumidifier installed somewhere in this chamber, wherever that dehumidifier is, we'll say he's right here. By taking a measurement in these two different locations, I can verify that the circulation is occurring fully between these two locations if they match. If they don't match, and if they're not the same, and this one over here is really warm and dry, and this one over here is kind of cold and wet, then obviously we're going to have much slower drying in this region. And the reason you're having much slower drying is because you have not installed these guys down here properly, right? These air movers. They're not installed properly. Really simple verification. It also gives you the justification for potentially using more of those air movers. If I can record this and verify that I don't have that balance, right? That's a reason to address my air mover installation component of my drying plan, okay? Now, again, we've had some episodes on technically speaking where we dove pretty deep into some of these different air movers and air mover types and kind of walked through some of these different elements in the air movers and what they're for. For example, we have this guy here, the standard traditional air mover versus a low profile versus an axial. These are my general drying air movers, the three down here. And each one of them has its role and its purpose and its advantages and disadvantages. In general, the low profile air mover is my specialty air mover for surface drying. Right? If all I want to do is use the least amount of power to move air around the perimeter of a room, then they're very, very efficient for that. They're very, very low power draw. These air movers really specialize in larger, more open spaces where I need more volume within that space to support whole room or whole area circulation. The low profile gives me better velocity. The axial gives me better volume. So in larger spaces, the axials can be much more effective versus the traditional air mover right here, where I get a little bit of a balance in between the two at a cost of energy consumption. They're not really the best specialist in either one of those cases, but they work well in either one, right? Versus some of my air movers that are more designed for ventilation of large spaces, right? Whether I'm ventilating large cavities in and around cabinetry or behind cabinetry, or ventilating crawl spaces, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have the ventilation of tight spaces with these inter-air drying systems, right? So there are all these categories in air movement that are designed to address all of these different areas throughout the project, depending on where I'm trying to get the air to move and to circulate or to ventilate. And they all have their specialty and they all have their application. And I kind of encourage that if air movement is an area where you'd like to really dig in and get a lot more information, like I said, we have some really good episodes that we did early this year that focused in specifically on some of the different types and categories of air movement. But at the end of the day, what's most important to zero in on and what's most important to focus on is just understanding that the psychrometry in the middle of the room is not the psychrometry that's important, right? The psychrometry that is important is the psychrometry at the surface where the water is present, at the surfaces where drying is occurring. That's where the psychrometry needs to be its best. And if there's one thing that hopefully, technically speaking, is driven for you this year and being reinforced here today, is that the thermal hygrometer is one instrument that we need to use in a lot more places, right? Don't just use the thermal hygrometer to check the box. Use the hygrometer to evaluate whether or not your drying system has properly been deployed. And again, that comes with monitoring at the wet surface, okay? All right, so kind of moving forward here, the next thing I want to touch on is kind of my call to action for for all of those that have been attending Technically Speaking throughout the last couple of years, I really want to drive kind of a thinking process that I think is uber critical for how we go about ensuring that we're staying in front of what's changing in the industry and staying in front of what is important to us from a development standpoint. And this is something I've touched on a couple of times as I've gone through different conversations throughout the years with the restoration community. And I want to just zero in on just how critical it is for us to continue to drive ourselves for continuous improvement. So here's a little process. It goes something like this. There are 4 kind of states of mind that people have as they go through the learning and development process. 4 different states of mind. The first state of mind is that we are always, in some way, shape, or form, subconsciously incompetent in what we do. Now, don't take offense to this. I'm not trying to share this with you to be offensive. This is me included. This is everybody on this planet, because we're not perfect, right? So all of us, to some degree, are subconsciously incompetent to what we do in some way, shape, or form. And part of the reason I know this is always true is because the industry is always changing, right? Even if you were fully competent in everything that you needed to be competent in your life, wait till tomorrow. It'll be different, right? Something's going to change, and all of a sudden you're not competent anymore. So it's important to admit this. This is what I would say is just being humble, right? It's a big part of what we need to do. And if you don't have this innately in you to just be aware that this is always a part of what we do, that makes you a little nervous every time you walk into that next job, makes you really just kind of sit back for a second, just question, am I really doing this right? Then I would be afraid, right? You need to have that anxiousness, if you will, inside of you. Now, what's going to happen is at some point, you're going to transition to the second state of mind. And the second state of mind is that at some point, you're going to be consciously incompetent. Let that sit for a second. It happens to me all the time when I have a conversation with my wife. Become consciously incompetent in some way, shape, or form, right? So something's going to happen that's going to make you aware of something you've got to work on. Now, this can happen because you attend a webinar and you learn something. This can happen because you read an article and you become aware of something. This can happen because you make a mistake, right? And all of a sudden you're fully aware of the fact that, well, I did that wrong, right? And now I can see the result of doing that wrong. I always say, by the way, that proactively looking into things like webinars and articles and just doing industry standards of care and things like this, proactively doing that is learning from other people's mistakes. And the best mistake you can possibly learn from is someone else's, right? That's one of my favorite philosophies in life. But regardless, something's going to happen. You're going to become consciously incompetent. This is just the second state of mind. Now, it's on each of us as professionals to work ourselves from the second state of mind to the third state of mind. And that is going to become consciously, if I can spell that right, competent. Right? Practice your trade, right? I've just become aware that I am not as good at X as I thought I might have been because something I've read, something I've done, something I've seen. So now I'm going to practice that trade, right? I'm going to get more information. I'm going to learn how I need to adjust and how I need to redirect or recalibrate how I do things. And I'm going to work towards that until I can see that I've changed that behavior, right? And become consciously competent in whatever it is that I'm working on. That's the third state of mind. Now, most of us stop there. And this is, I think, the difference between people that are good at what they do and people that are really great at what they do is they recognize that there's a fourth state. And this, to me, is the real eye-opener that I have when I first had this conversation with a gentleman named Graham Dick a long time ago. Becoming subconsciously competent, but even more importantly, recognizing that subconsciously competent is not a good thing, right? This is what you need to avoid. Getting to a point where you become so competent in what you've worked on that you're no longer cognitively or intentionally thinking about something that you're working on. As soon as you get to a point where anything that you've set out for yourself to improve, to get better at, to change or recalibrate about how you do things, those things have all gone away because you've accomplished them and they're done, and you're no longer actively trying to drive yourself to improve or become better, then that's the danger zone. Because we have to remind ourselves that step number one is always true, right? And this is the cycle. And if we don't repeat the cycle, you may be perfectly prepared for the industry of yesterday, but you're perfectly antiquated for the industry of tomorrow if this cycle does not continue. And there are all kinds of ways that I can give as a case in point for this, and not the least of which being just how rapidly standards of care are changing in our industry, right? How rapidly the consumers in our industry are changing, and their expectations and their knowledge base, or at least assumptions based on what they're seeing on YouTube or wherever else they're getting information about, so and so that had a water damage and this is what was done, and now the homeowner's an expert, right? So because of all of these variables that are constantly changing in our industry, the way that we did it today will never be good enough for the way we do it tomorrow. And we have to stay in front of that. And we can only do that. And that's part of the reason I wanted to dive into this today, because I think it's really timely, kind of coming into the end of 2023, getting started for 2024. That's when most of us really sit back and reflect on, how did I do in 23 and what am I going to do different in 24? So hopefully this, along with the flow chart that I covered right at the very beginning, what I'm hoping to do is to give you a couple of things that really drive that thinking as you sit back and think about those things, kind of going through the holidays and kind of recharging and turning off the noise of daily business and just really reflecting on yourself personally. And as I've shared a few times, I've been in this industry for a little over 30 years, and education and standards, those have been really the key parts of what I've been involved in the industry and really participated in. So it's given me an opportunity to really appreciate just how critical this is, especially working in standards and seeing some of the folks that I've had an opportunity to work with there, and really observing what about those individuals really makes them really the gems they are for our industry. Some of these folks that I've met through standards, and most of them, a big part of that is this kind of thinking. This kind of thinking, and I've heard it phrased once. One of the things that I've heard said before that really drove this home for me is that the most successful people in our industry have an interesting balance, or an appropriate balance between humble and confident. And they almost seem like opposites, but in reality, they need to live in harmony, right, with one another, regardless of what it is that we're digging into, whether it's our, inside a business or out, right? Finding that right balance between these two. Some of the best trainers that I've met in our industry are those that strike that right balance. If you be 100% humble but not confident in what you're teaching me, I'm not going to absorb it, right? If you're 100% confident in what you're teaching and don't take any questions and that you can't answer unless you get offended by them, and then I'm not going to absorb that either, right? It's that right balance between being humble and confident. And I think that's something that carries as a principle into how we operate in business. So those are the key pieces. Those are the key recaps. At this point, I want to close out with a couple of things here, close out the session with a couple of updates and notifications, and then we're going to get into our Q&A session. So again, just a reminder, if you haven't had a chance to do it yet, go ahead and open up that Q&A tool, drop some questions into the Q&A so that we can field those once I get through a couple of announcements here, and then we'll take those kind of open mic here, and we'll go through anything that you have that you'd like to throw out for a question. So with that, open up your Q&A tool, and I will run through just a couple of things here I want to touch on. The first is just talking a little bit about next year and what's going to happen next year with Technically Speaking. We are going to have a season 3, which is amazing. I can't say thank you enough for those that have been attending all the way through the first couple of years of this webinar, if you will, and those that have helped me really mature this into the format that it's in now. Would love to hear your feedback on that, by the way. Are you still liking the format that we've shifted to over the last couple of years? Would you like to see anything different? My focus in season 3 is going to be a lot on some of these new standards that are coming out. We have the S700 fire standard that is right at the door. It's about ready to release. I would say it's probably in the first quarter of next year, which is amazing. That was really, really hard work by a number of people, and I'm super excited that's going to come out. So look for that S700 fire restoration standard, first quarter of 2024. If that's not on your radar, make sure that you're paying attention to it. We have a brand new standard for S590 HVAC assessment. That is something that already hit the streets just a few weeks ago. Really helps us shore up when you're dealing with a water damage, what needs to happen with the HVAC system, or a fire damage, or any other type of catastrophic event to that property. Tommy Yakabellis, wonderful, wonderful individual, chaired that, did a wonderful job on it with his consensus body. By the way, the IICRC will hold its own webinar on that S590 here sometime in the early part of 2024. So look for that too. Look for that. And you can learn from Tommy Yakabellis and others specifically on that 590 standard. The S520 revision is just about to wrap up. That's our mold remediation standard. So we'll spend some time on that next year as well. It's likely we will also get a couple of other standards that are going to come out next year. There's a standard on wildfire restoration, the S760, that likely is going to come out sometime next year. There is a standard on commercial water damage, the 550. So I'm going to draw a lot on those areas as those standards come out next year, and we'll call it kind of a standards-focused year for the most part. However, I'm still very, very open to anything that you want in the lineup. So if there's anything you would like to hear about, email me at brburton@corelogic.com, and I will ensure that we wrap that into the lineup for next year. So you can directly impact the content for Technically Speaking. We get, usually a couple hundred people on each one of these, and I'm amazed at how few actually send me ideas for content. So if you want to have an impact, I guarantee if you send me an email, it's going to impact the content. So send me an email at brburton.com, or brburton@corelogic.com rather, and you can directly impact our lineup for next year. Second set of announcements I want to run through here real quick is that we do have Interconnect coming up in January 21 through 24 in Austin, Texas, wonderful town of Austin, Texas. If you're already signed up for it, wonderful. We're going to love to see you there. If you're not signed up for it, you can do me a favor, use my little QR code on the screen. You can toss me a bone and you'll give me credit for being the one that got you to sign up. So use that little QR code on the screen there. But seriously, if you're not signed up for it, Interconnect is really unique because it really represents the full brushstroke of our entire industry. And you don't see that a lot with trade shows. There's a number of wonderful trade shows out there, but Interconnect is super, super unique. I've never had an event impact me more personally than Interconnect, just because I got to really hear and see and be exposed to a much broader range of perspectives in the industry than those that were really just focused on one particular vertical within the industry. All right, so I encourage you to attend if you're not already attending. Plus, Austin's always a great town, right? Great place to hang out in Austin. Love Austin. All right, so those are the announcements. Now let's roll over to the Q&A. And again, as I roll over to the Q&A, if you don't already have my email address, it's right there at the bottom of the screen, brburton@corelogic.com. All right, so let's roll over into the Q&A. First question I see up here is from Bruce. And again, I'll always throw out the first name when I see questions. I won't call you out first and last, I promise. But Bruce asks, just a comment. Thank you very much, Bruce. I much, much appreciate that. The time that I've spent in industry, and just to kind of comment on your comment, Bruce, the time that I've spent in industry, I'll give you a really, really significant call to action for everybody on the phone. If you have any interest in kind of the future of this industry and really want to have an impact, what's been most rewarding to me is that involvement in standards. So I would highly encourage those of you, especially since I see so many names on this list that are with us on each one of these episodes. If you've got that much passion for this industry, you really need to get involved in the standard writing and development process. So check that out at iicrc.org. So thank you for that, Bruce. And it looks like, for the first time in Technically Speaking, it looks like we don't actually have a lot of questions. Normally we have a lot of questions that roll through as we go into the Q&A period, but it looks like we don't have a lot this year. And I think that's probably because we're all thinking about our holiday season and getting off and away from the thought of business and into our families. And I'll be honest with you, I'm starting to think the same. So with that, I'm going to wrap us up by wishing all of you wonderful holidays. Thank you so much for spending this second season with me here on Technically Speaking. I look forward to season 3, and we'll see you then. Take care.